Rana, do you want to introduce John, our moderator for this great session we're about to go into?
Yes, absolutely. As the panelists are all turning on their cameras, you know, John Drimmer has been a long-time participant in the area of human rights. He is a partner at Paul Hastings law firm based in Washington, D.C., and John's been part of a complex cross-border problems with the benefit of having sat in every chair at the table, from senior legal officer for a global 500 company to a federal prosecutor, a seasoned advocate, and he's recognized as an international expert on anti-corruption and business and human rights. He's also a frequent speaker, an author, a commentator on issues related to both of these topics. His experience in designing and implementing anti-corruption and human rights programs, including various human rights remedy schemes, and has served as an industry standard. John has overseen investigations around the world related to anti-corruption, human rights, and represented companies and individuals in numerous government enforcement proceedings in both the US and overseas in relation to FCPA, bribery, claims of human rights issues, as well as a wide range of additional subjects. We could talk all day about John's fantastic skills and backgrounds. I've had the privilege of working with John on a advisory board over the years, a couple of different advisory boards over the years, and we are really excited to have John moderate this session. Yesterday was extremely informative, and I will hand over to John and get you to introduce your fantastic panel.
Thank you so much, Ronan. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and really looking forward to a terrific discussion over the next hour. As Ronan mentioned, I'm Jonathan Drimmer, a partner at Paul Hastings, a global law firm in the Washington, D.C. office, and have focused largely on issues related to responsible business conduct. And, you know, for our star-studded panel today, and just to tee up the issues a bit and give a sense of what's to come, you know, we are seeing a tremendous amount of discussion around legal and regulatory issues that are connected directly and indirectly to social audit firms. We're hearing and reading about reports and issues related to potential auditor liability in connection with social audits that ultimately are being performed, discussed, and referenced. We're seeing auditors being thrust into legal proceedings, whether as witnesses or in connection with producing documents or other kinds of evidence. We're seeing reports come out in this context as well about clients, factories, evading auditors, and some of the steps and techniques that are being taken to undermine the integrity of audit processes from the client side. Against this backdrop, we're also seeing rapid regulatory changes, increased discussions about mandatory due diligence that extends to human rights, to the environment, and potentially to governance issues as well, being driven by the EU, but existing in other markets as well. And no doubt, these legal changes, these regulatory changes, these movements are going to have a huge impact on the profession, on its role, and on these legal issues that ultimately we are talking about. So to help us work through these nettlesome problems and talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that exist in the market in light of them, we have three terrific panelists. So I'm going to start with Matthias Thorn is part of the senior management of the International Organization of Employers, the largest global business network representing over 50 million companies. He has a strong expertise in human rights and responsible business conduct, industrial relations, and employment policies. He has more than 15 years of experience in advocacy and negotiating at the UN, the OECD, the EU, and national institutions, as well as at G20 and G7. So welcome, Matthias. Rochelle Jackson, it's very nice to see you again. Rochelle is with Arch International and has over 23 years of experience working on human rights, labor, and traceability issues in global supply chains, specializing in child labor and forced labor. She has conducted roughly 2,000 social assessments in 75 countries across a range of industries. Recently worked with UNICEF on mapping child labor risks in global supply chains, She's authored living wage guidance for auditors on behalf of the Global Living Wage Coalition and worked with brands on living wage policies and wage ladder approaches. And just, Rochelle, after our session last night, I went back and 2,000 social assessments. So if each one of those was one day, that would have been 5.5 straight years of social assessments, just to put some context to the math. Finally, Colleen Theron is a solicitor and founder of Ardea International, a specialist company that helps other companies with business and human rights challenges. She has many years working with business and organizations and NGOs across a range of sectors. She's also author of a book, Strategic Sustainable Procurement Law and Best Practice. She was nominated as one of the top 100 corporate modern slavery influencers in the UK in 2018. And Colleen, welcome to you too. So before we start, and to just kind of get things loosened up a bit, we are gonna start with two polling questions, and then we'll go and we'll have reflections from our panelists. We'll come back with 2 more polling questions that are, again, designed to get a feel for the audience in terms of some of the operational changes, legal liability considerations that are going on. We'll open it up to Q&A at that point. So first, we'll start with our 2 polling questions if we want to tee those up. So I'll read it out. Do you, as an auditor, see legal liability for auditors as a current concern in social auditing? Do you see this as a concern? We talked about it a little bit in the market, but are you seeing it yourselves? You have 3 potential yes answers: substantial risk, medium risk, low risk, and you have a no risk. 4 options if you would answer. And how does it look? So we have most participants, really an overwhelming majority of participants, that's about 84%, see it as a substantial risk or a medium risk. So among the group, and this is not too different from what we saw last night, it was about 75% last night. So most folks are seeing legal liability for auditors as a current concern in social auditing. And I'm, again, drawing this between substantial risk, about 35%, and then low or no risk, which is about 16%. So overwhelming majority do see this as a real risk in the sector. Question number 2. So this is designed to get to interactions with clients. And one of the ways, part of it, the reason it's relevant, as we think about legal liability issues, one of the questions is always, what are you talking about with your clients? Are they breaching it with you? Are you breaching it with them? Are you changing the way you're doing your engagement documents, etc.? Interaction with clients. So in the last 2 years, has your firm faced increasing legal liability questions from clients? Increasing legal liability questions. It's a yes or no answer if you wouldn't mind answering now. And how does it look? About 50-50. It's same as last night. So about last night, it was roughly evenly split as well. So I would say the results from last night and today look quite similar. Most people do see it as a concern in the sector, about 50-50 in terms of getting questions about legal liability from clients. So with that, with the star-studded panel ready to go, I am going to start with Matthias and ask you if you wouldn't mind kicking us off and telling us a little bit about what you are seeing from your vantage point on the association side, the employer association side, as it reflects the social auditing sector, some of the legal changes, and the issues we've been talking about, as well as the poll results.
Thank you, John. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you just fine.
Perfect. That's great. So, John, we have seen in the last years very dynamic developments with regards to business and human rights. right? Alone in the last 12 months, we had legislation, supply chain legislation in Switzerland, in Norway, in Germany. And as you said, John, the European Commission will present its proposal for supply chain legislation on 5th of December. So we see, at least in Europe, many, many developments. And of course, these developments, these legal developments, will increase the need for social audits, for quality social audits. And when you look more specifically on the regulation in Norway, for instance, the law covers companies from 50 employees onwards. So these are really small companies, which so far probably never really engage in social audits, which so far probably never engage in due diligence. And also the EU directive is expected to cover companies with 250 employees onwards. Again, these are relatively small companies, which probably so far did not do anything so much on human rights due diligence or on social audits. So there's a real need to develop some approaches to help these companies to engage in this field. And these approaches need to be financially viable, because these smaller companies, these medium-sized companies, often lack the financial resources, and it needs to be covered really with a supportive structure, right? Taking them by the hand to do the job. Of course, social audits and due diligence are not the same thing. And many people pointed in the past that social audits alone is not sufficient. But nevertheless, social audits are an important part of responsible supply chain management, and they are an important part of supply chain legislation, supply chain due diligence. And that is the reason why the need will increase through these legislative developments. Social audits are one part of due diligence. Another important part is capacity building of the suppliers. And I think there's a huge opportunities for bigger partnerships, for organizations who can now deliver these kind of quality capacity building on the ground for suppliers, and who can follow up on audit findings to make sure that there are remedies to these audit findings. And one possibility I would like to offer here is the engagement and partnership with employers' organization on the ground, because they are not only enjoying the trust of the company, of the local business in the country, but they are continuously there. So they are not flying in for once per year or every 2 years, but they are continuously there and can continuously support the companies in order to follow up on audit findings and to make sure that the next audits are better. Another partnership where I can see real benefit is a stronger partnership between audit providers and companies who provide digital solutions. Right, the typical digital solution for increased traceability, for workers' voice, and so on and so forth. Because these are always complementary; they don't replace each other. And through this complementary approach, both sides become stronger: the social audit side, as well as the initiative coming from these new digital solutions provider. And my last point here I would like to stress, particularly in view of these legislative developments, is that we have a communication problem. I'm based here in Geneva and very much engaged in the discussion at the UN, at the ILO, and social auditors is always referred as the CSR industry, which would benefit everyone, but not the workers, and would not benefit the communities where these workers live in. So there is a need on the one hand to ensure the quality of audits, but at the same time also to be more open to see how many incidents actually were discovered by social audits and were followed up, were remediated. So to really show the benefits, the real, by data, real benefits of social audits, because so far here in Geneva, in New York, this is lost. It is only, as I said, referred as the CSR industry. So at the end of my 5 minutes, just wanted to say that from the IE side, from the International Organization of Employers, we're more than happy to engage with you, to partner with you, to see how we can jointly support companies in the supply chain management. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias. That is a terrific insight and terrific perspective. And indeed, audits are one part of a due diligence process. I expect we're going to be hearing that theme a little bit over the next 47 of our remaining minutes. But Rochelle Jackson, I want to come to you and talk a little bit about your perspective on some of the changes that we're seeing, feeling any pressures on the legal liability risk side, that type of thing, again, from the assessment standpoint.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. I think maybe it's worth mentioning I'm actually in I'm based in California, but I'm in Canada auditing today, here all this week, auditing farms that have temporary foreign workers from Latin America. But to answer your question and to jump right in here, yeah, I think for audit firms, we definitely are paying attention to the conversations around liability right now, and looking specifically at the context of some of the NGOs that have been trying to bring the topic of liability into legislation, for example, is something that we're looking at. And in some of the articles and letters from these groups that I've looked at, I think they tend to conflate the topics of audits and certification. And so I think it's worth a moment just to differentiate that from an auditor perspective, and I think most of us on this call can understand that there are very different concepts around certification and auditing in terms of what they're trying to achieve. Certifications are usually paid for by the company that's receiving the certificate as a means to demonstrate that they have the management systems in place to adhere to the areas and topics covered by the certification. It doesn't mean that they're perfect in what they're implementing, but it means that they have the potential to identify, address, and manage issues effectively as they arise. And this is true of all certification-based products, whether they be environmental or quality or social certifications like RAP and SA8000. Audits are more often paid for by an interested third party, like a brand or a retailer that is purchasing products from a supplier in their supply chain. And in all of my comments, I'm just going to say brand because that's easier than specifying all of the different entities that might do this. But I'm using it as an encompassing term. So these audits tend to report on current practices compared to any contractual expectations between that brand and that supplier. And the scope and depth of the audit activity is determined by the brand, not the audit firm itself. And I feel like as we look at liability and we think about what some stakeholder groups are trying to accomplish with discussions of liability, it's really important to bring this understanding to the table. Decisions about scope and depth of audits are usually made related to the intentions of that brand. Why are they auditing? What is the size of their supply chain? What depth of supply chain will they audit? Are they looking at tier 1, 2, 3, or 4? What are their budget constraints? And because no brand answers these questions in the same way, they may all deploy social audits differently in their supply chain and the strategy that they're adopting. A lot of brands may choose to use primarily a one-day audit model. This most closely matches some of the comments, for example, in the Clean Clothes campaign letter about audits that have a short amount of time on premises. Brands might use this model because they want a superficial level of visibility across as much of their supply chain as possible. And they may use this strategy for several years, trying to reach the bulk of their suppliers. And then they might change their audit model over time, expanding to additional days as they look at different topics, or they add on issues like environmental. And that really depends on their corporate goals and why they have this program in place. So what I think we've seen over the decades that social auditing has been around is that brands grow and evolve their programs over time based on all these different factors, including, as we're seeing now, legislative mandates and the corporate commitments vis-a-vis CEO support and the budget that a brand can dedicate to these efforts. So all of those kind of decisions around the strategy, are not made by audit firms. But that said, to really look specifically at the topic of auditor liability, as we've discussed, social auditing has been around for over 30 years. I've been an auditor for 25. It took us about 2 decades until we had APSCA in place. But the demand and the discussions for a professionalized auditor association began way before APSCA. But what happened is that the audit firms themselves were not included in those discussions, and other entities were trying to impose the professionalization from outside, and it failed. And it was only when audit firms had the opportunity to embrace the professionalization of their industry that APSCA was launched and has become the industry force and presence that it is. And what it's really done for us as an industry is to establish a floor, you know, of an acceptable level of quality and professionalism for auditors, which is important. But I kind of see this concept of liability in a similar vein. We shouldn't exclude practitioners from discussions around how to create greater accountability or liability. And I think there are other audit professions that can be looked to for models of how this sort of liability is managed, including financial audit firms of the world. So it's not an unprecedented development to have these sorts of pressures arising within the profession. But as we think about how it will play out in this sector related to specific audit firms, I think we need to note that not all audit firms are alike. Within APSCA, we have tiered memberships that include very large firms and extremely small ones. The largest audit firms have in-house legal support, and they'll have a framework to address this sort of liability. They may either see this as similar to other types of liability that they have to manage in their other audit and certification work, or they may see it as an unnecessary new burden or too challenging to manage. So for these very large firms, social audits tend to be a really small % of their work, and you know, they'll have the option to just choose to exit the market altogether. I think it's too soon to say how it will play out for them. I think it's really the smaller firms that are wholly dedicated to social auditing that most need to grapple with this. And I was speaking with Greg from Arch Advisors 2 weeks ago about this topic, and his comment to me was, if you do a good job, what's your liability? So I think conceptually for auditors, a challenge we really face is defining what an audit is capable of and the constraints around what it's not capable of. Some stakeholders believe it's the responsibility of an audit to identify every possible topic that brings risk to workers. And Rana Plaza is a great example of that. There was a lot of outcry about how a social auditor failed to do the job of a civil engineer. And if a social auditor's scope of work is the working conditions at a site, should they also be prepared to assess building integrity? In the end, in that particular instance, I believe the answer from the industry was no. Auditors don't have the appropriate skill set. They're not engineers, and a social audit can't be all things to all people. So the industry response in Bangladesh ultimately took a different tact in assessing building integrity. Nevertheless, there are stakeholders that continue to view that as a failing of social audits. So it's imperative in all of these discussions around liability to define the goal and aim of the audit and express fully the constraints of what it can achieve. So from my perspective, social audits are tools for gathering data on conditions within constraints that auditors face around time and access to information and to workers. And of course, those are factors that the auditors themselves don't control. Social audit is really different from a multi-week investigation carried out by journalists or NGOs, and it therefore cannot yield the same results, even though in these like news reports, we always see them being compared. Why didn't they find the same things? But ultimately, as Matthias said, social audits are like one approach, or they're part of like one tool in a toolkit that companies can use to advance due diligence in their supply chains. And it shouldn't be the only tool, but it is a source of data and an activity that can complement other efforts to create a holistic human rights due diligence program. But my experience over the years has been that the landscape of auditing just continues to evolve. And I think most of the firms, especially within APSCA, are going to find the balance between carrying out audits to the scope defined by their clients and finding a way to manage this, any new perceived liability that's coming up.
It's terrific, Michelle. Thank you. And I think just a couple of points to tease out on Rana Plaza. There was litigation involving social auditing, at least one social auditing firm in connection with Rana Plaza, and the case against it was dismissed in part for the reasons that you identify, capacity, ability, expectations, etc. And no doubt, as we think about what audits are and what they aren't, and audits versus certifications, doing it and performing audits in a highly professional way, as Greg has mentioned, and what you put into reports and the extent to which you're willing to make broad statements versus statements that really are reflecting, the methodology pursued. All of these things are relevant, obviously, from a legal liability standpoint. But with that, I'm going to go over to another lawyer on the panel, Colleen, and look for your insights from the standpoint that you have in working with big companies, with multinational enterprises, as they are focusing on this from the customer side, the consumer aspect of it. And so would you share your insights on the issues we've talked about in the polling results?
Yeah, thank you, John, and thank you both to Rachel and to Matthias for your comments. I think one of the things that have struck me that has come through from both Rachel and Matthias, of course, is that audit, as we know, is one aspect of what is regarded as a part of a due diligence framework. But I think what is particularly interesting is when you listen to what Rachel said about, trying to distinguish for some organizations what the difference is between certification is and auditing, is the thing that I see, and not just this is my experience is not limited to working with multinationals, it's working with organizations of different sizes across different sectors. And I think that what I've seen, and particularly seeing in the last 5 years, is different approaches to audit, in the sense that some organizations will rely solely on audits. And I think for them, COVID has been a huge shock, because, where you have your 1,000 auditors or audits being taken, going to scope over your tier 1 suppliers to give a snapshot, and maybe even as part of a tick boxing exercise to say, phew, I'm okay. You were suddenly faced with not being able to do that, and the challenge then of how do I get visibility of what is actually going on in relation to my supply chain. I think the other approaches that I see with organizations are not just taking an audit approach, is some other organizations do nothing. Like they just try to, I think, literally hide behind the fact that they don't have any leverage, or they don't have the resources, or they don't have the time, and they don't have the appetite. And then sort of the third bucket are those organizations starting to grapple with, well, what role does audit play? What role does certification play from a customer point of view, or from a B2B point of view, to really ensure that they, from a reputational and a legal liability perspective, are putting in mitigation efforts to ensure that if there is going to be litigation, or if there's going to be questions around their reputation, that they have some kind of procedure that they can fall back on. And I think that when you look at the changes in the legislation, and I think, so I'm not talking about potential auditor liability, I want to talk more broadly around the landscape changes that we've seen relating to legislation, holding businesses to account for how they might address negative human rights impacts. And that is relevant also to how businesses are going to approach this issue, because we've seen that the body of sort of what we call reporting legislation, like the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, like the Australian Act, like the California Transparency Supply Chain Act, they are legislation that requires businesses to report on the things that they have found in their supply chain, or how they are addressing the risks. But it doesn't go as far as asking them to actually demonstrate what they are doing. And as Matthias had explained when he first started talking about what is happening in Europe, we are seeing a tremendous change in government appetite in drafting legislation that is going to request organizations to demonstrate the actual actions of what they are doing in relation to addressing potential negative human rights impacts in their organizations. And that, of course, is quite a far step away from what we had as have as a benchmark with the United Nations Guiding Principles, which for many of you listening will be familiar with. They were endorsed in 2011, and we saw a universal kind of uptake, very swift uptake of them. And of course, they are all relied on in the legislation that we are seeing in Europe and the proposed EU directive. So when you see the shift in legislation, and potentially how that is going to change the way that organizations are going to have to deal with human rights issues. I think this is where it becomes interesting to look at auditing again as part of that process, because it's going to be critical for a business, if they're relying on social audit, to be able to take the data, be able to report on the data in their due diligence strategies, or in the German Supply Chain Act in their report to the regulator. And that means critically they should be understanding that the data that they're getting and what they're seeing is a snapshot that they can rely on. And that will go to the point about why one would look for auditors to be certified, why there needs to be a professional standard around this, why there needs to be the ability to, I guess, have faith in what is being done. One other point I wanted to just bring into my last 5 minutes, and it goes again also to getting business to really understand the distinction between reporting and due diligence and certification and audit. And that is also understanding that audit is not per se engagement with rights holders. It is, and yet that is a very critical point, and Matthias, you brought this up, the requirement to engage with stakeholders is being built into the legislation, and audit isn't that. So again, if companies stand back and have to look at what it is that they have to do, what they really need to be understanding is, what is their framework? What human rights due diligence framework do they have, or do they have to build, so that they can build and pull in all these things? And I think, John, to go back to your question to me, this is what I'm seeing as a challenge across the board, is organizations now having to say, well, actually, what do we even understand by human rights due diligence? What do we understand by environmental due diligence? Because that's another aspect that's being brought into the legislation. And how are we going to develop these frameworks so that we have a roadmap of continuous improvement to be able to really, in many ways, mitigate the risk of any potential legal liability coming our way, basically. So I think I'll stop on that. That was, I had a script, but there were so many other things that have been brought to the fore by Rachel and Matthias that I think hopefully the insight around just some of the distinction between the kind of laws that are developing will be helpful to this discussion.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Colleen. So at this point, and we're doing great on time, I want to open it up to questions. And the way that this is going to proceed is, first, we're going to have two more polling questions that build off the first two that we listed on our liability questions and concerns. I'll probably use my prerogative to ask a couple of questions of you guys, but please do, audience members, start putting your questions in for our panel, and glad to pose them as they come in. But why don't we start with our second poll and the questions associated with that. So the question here is, and this is sort of the punchline, the bottom line: have you or your firm experienced increased operational cost or disruption with increased litigation associated with social compliance audits? And really what that's asking is not just have you been a party to a litigation, but have you been asked to be a witness? Have you been asked for information in connection with the case? Have you received a subpoena for documents? Has there been increased involvement because of litigation issues or risks, whether as a party or not? And we have three answers: yes, significantly; yes, some; and no, if you wouldn't mind answering now. We'll give it just another second. All right, how does it look? So most people, about half, say that there's some, and 16% significantly. So again, consistent with the original polling question, the first polling question about increased concerns, we do have about 65% of the folks who responded saying that there is some or significant increases in litigation costs or disruption. So the issues associated with the concerns that we saw on our first slide, which comes about 85%, seem to be borne out by experiences connected to increased legal, let's say, risks plus expenses. So let me go to the second question. This goes to what steps have you taken? Have you taken steps to address legal liability and operating cost disruptions? And we have a yes, no, or haven't yet, but we are planning to. So again, as we talk about these legal risks, these legal concerns, a lot of people who've responded say they have faced increased disruption, have faced increased cost, they are seeing concerns. Have you started to take steps to address it? And those steps can be obviously anything from, the nature of your engagement letters and indemnification in your engagement letters, to how you're doing reports, how you're describing your projects, to some of the issues we've talked about in terms of, not over-promising, not saying something's a certification when it really isn't. So different steps. Could be anywhere on the spectrum, ultimately to address concerns related to legal liability and the cost disruptions from the prior questions. We'll give it another second. All right. How does it look? So we have about 70, almost 80% who say that they have taken steps or that they are planning to take steps in light of some of the risks and challenges that we've been talking about this morning. So the overwhelming majority are either taking or planning to take steps in connection with some of the risks that we've seen. So be very interested if you want to put into the chat some of the steps that you have taken, and happy to share those with the group, in addition to the questions that I hope you'll post. But with that, why don't we start with our questions to our panelists? And again, as I mentioned, I think I will take the prerogative here, and I want to start in reverse order. So Colleen, if I could start with you, and from your vantage point and what you are seeing from where you sit, so tell me a little bit about what companies can do to ensure they're meeting the growing legislative due diligence requirements, and whether that's a framework, whether that is increasing their connection with social audits. Tell me a little bit about what companies can be doing and how that impacts the social auditing sector.
Yeah, so I think I would almost say the very first thing is for a company to understand its appetite for embracing and ensuring that they are going to meet the requirements of the law as much as go beyond that. And I'm saying that because I think that what I have seen is that the corporate culture of an organization is really critical to how all of these issues are managed. Because if the culture is such that organizations want to ensure that there aren't negative human rights impacts on modern slavery in their supply chain, they will spend time and money and resource on these issues. So, and I am precluding that. It's not just starting with a kind of legal piece, which is, one of the things that is obvious for them to do is to start thinking about what a due diligence framework would look like, and referring back to the UNGPs. And so basics are, do they have policy commitments? have they if they've got policies, when last did they review them? Are they even meeting international standards? We know we've seen so much change in international standards that, you know, many I see a lot of supplier codes of conduct, for example, that are just, you know, so outdated. It's quite astonishing when sometimes you look at the size of the company or the companies involved, what is written in there. So understanding what they have in terms of policies and setting those out in their commitments, and then whatever is set out in a policy is really putting in place due diligence procedures that are robust and that can underpin those policy commitments. And so, you know, what they are going to have to then think about in their procedures is as part of identifying and tracking and monitoring what their potential impact is, social audit would form part of that. And actually, to Matthias's point as well, increasingly also the use of data platforms or worker voice technology. So there's one of the things that Auditor has been doing a lot of is working collaboratively with some data providers and different elements and building in continuous due diligence, not assessments, but well, some of it's assessments and some of it's monitoring and tracking and identification as a means of complementing social audit. So, and then the other thing, I think the last point I want to make of what I see businesses, some businesses doing well, and then I think forms a critically part of due diligence is training and awareness, making sure that training is fit for purpose, that the right people are trained about the right things to understand what is required of them. And then I think lastly, increasingly, what grievance mechanisms have they developed? What are their remediation protocols? How are they escalating things when they've been identified by audit or by their other sides? And that, I think, is an area that we're going to see growing and maturing in the next 5 years as companies are beginning to understand what their obligations are in that area.
Thank you, Colleen. It's terrific. And so, Rochelle, let me ask you a question. I want to come back to this because we're getting some questions in that have a bit more detail, but I want to start fairly general, if I could. Is there a role for APSCA related to auditor liability? What might that role be?
Yeah, certainly as you know, the professional association for auditors, I think it's a great place to have a platform for grappling with these issues. We know APSCA, you know, they're not going to insure auditors. They're not the solution to risks of liability. They're already serving a great purpose in providing qualified people, like setting that floor, as I mentioned, and going back to Greg's comment, if you're doing a good job, you know, what's your liability? So kind of helping auditors maintain skills, stay on top of the standards that they should be following, and keeping the firms employing them kind of accountable to that level of professional qualification. I will also add, just listening to Colleen and her discussion around the legislation just reminds me, you know, being in California, and when the California Supply Chain Transparency Act came out in 2010, I was at a firm that had a conference, and we invited a drafter of that legislation, which was the first modern slavery legislation in the world. And we had him come speak at our conference, and he was stunned to find out that companies actually do any kind of engagement in their supply chain, and he knew absolutely nothing about supply chains. And it was really instructive for me just in how lucky we got that legislation was not very prescriptive, that the way that it was drafted, it was kind of open and flexible. I certainly thought it was going to lead companies to do things a little differently than they did, but you know, many countries then modeled on that, and it's almost just like a happy accident that it wasn't a mess as far as how it addressed supply chains. So if I think about APSCA, you know, I don't know that Rana wants to take this on, but you know, there always is an opportunity for more instruction and engagement to help some lawmakers understand the reality of supply chains. I know in Europe, a lot of companies have really been engaging with lawmakers to try to do that, just because you don't want these laws written in a way that doesn't reflect the reality of supply chains and the way companies interact with them. So I think that's maybe an open question back to APSCA, is that a role as far as just helping to provide that reality check and that information about how some of these things function in reality as lawmakers look to draft legislation. But overall, I think APSCA fulfills an important role already, and that can help in itself mitigate liability just by having these qualifications for auditors in place.
It's terrific. Thank you. So Matthias, let me come to you then, and can you just tell us all a little bit about what advice the IOE is giving its members about social auditing needs in light of the mandatory due diligence requirements? What's the nature of the advice the organization is providing, given the changing legislative landscape?
So I think we do it in two ways. On the one hand, we really engage on the supplier level to give them basic capacity. What are the UN guiding principles? What are human rights risks? How to deal with them? How to engage on the different topics? So very practical to help them to understand better what are the expectations of buyers in the US, in Europe, and where else. So that is one very concrete activity we do. And the other one is what we do at the moment, particularly in view of the upcoming EU legislation, to engage with our members to help them to better understand actually what are the different parts of a due diligence legislation, because due diligence legislation is not due diligence legislation, right? They're really very different. And when you look at the legislation between Switzerland, Germany, Norway, they all completely differ from each other. Switzerland focusing only on child labor, on conflict minerals, and then basically on transparency. Germany having more like a general due diligence obligation for the first tier, and then Norway going much more, for the smaller companies. And one point I think, and which is also very important for APSCA, is the question about whether the EU directive will have a liability clause. Because at the moment, when you have a liability clause for companies for what happened in their supply chain, there will be much more pressure on social auditors to be also liable for what they do. The company, when I'm a big company and I'm hire a social auditor to assure me that in my supply chain, the problems are found and remediated through me then, and if that is not done, I want to make sure this guy is held liable, right? So I think the liability clause and whether there will be one is crucial also for APSCA and for the APSCA member. And what it seems like and what we are all hearing, that there will be a liability clause, particularly for high risk sectors. Now that is of course a very broad term. What are high risk sectors, right? And who want to define them, to be completely honest. And it will make it much more messy if that is indeed the case, right? If that is drafted in this way. So that is our engagement on this, both practical support for suppliers, support for member federations, how to engage in the discussion on due diligence legislation.
Thank you very much. That's terrific. And by the way, we are hearing that the European Commission's draft should be coming out in about a month on December 8th, although we've heard that it was coming out in June, and then we heard it was coming out in October. And so, I wouldn't write that in stone, but we are hearing December 8th. So let me ask this question, because I'm going to combine a question that we received just now and a question we received last night, and to some extent, this reflects on the market changes. So the expectation is with increased legislation that does demand due diligence, there's going to be an increased demand for social auditing. And yet at the same time, if we have increased risks of liability and legal risk, does that threaten to push certain social auditors or auditing firms out of the market? Do the legal liability risks threaten to cause people to walk away? And on the other hand, the question we had last night is the legal liability risks do add some level of protection in terms of professionalism. And so in that sense, they're positive. And so how are you seeing the legal risk that we've been talking about, positive, negative, in light of some of the market changes? And maybe, Rochelle, maybe I'll start with you from the auditing perspective, and then go across our panel.
Okay, yeah. Do I see it as positive or negative? it is a mixed bag. Surely, I think it would really depend on seeing, for example, what the EC directive looks like, just the way that that liability is framed. I think accountability is important. I think doing good and qualified work is important, and as much as it helps the industry to become better performing, reliable, consistent, all of those things help everyone. They help the work that's being done to be better, which means people that benefit from that work are going to benefit, and that's the goal. I think that we will see some attrition. I think that there will be firms that find it too complex, that are not going to see the value equation in staying engaged. I think that there'll be freelance auditors who walk away into maybe a lateral move into a different area of auditing that doesn't pose the same risks. So I think that there will be some sort of impact. Hopefully in the end, the industry will find a way and grapple with the best approach to balance these demands.
Yeah, and what are the implications if firms walk away before moving on?
Yeah, I think as it stands, I think it's difficult to get enough social auditors to do the work. I think there's definitely a theme, and COVID hasn't really helped, just a shortage of qualified people, even though APSCA is doing a great job of rolling out and making accessible qualification platform. As more companies require or choose to use social auditing as a tool in due diligence, the demand for people to do it is going to increase. I think Matthias said that earlier. So the implication is a big shortage of firms and people able to do this. And then, you know, that's itself is going to have an impact trying to deal with that shortage and get people online who are suitably qualified to do the work.
Mm. So Carlene, how are you seeing it from your standpoint as a lawyer, as an advisor? You know, on the one hand, the increased legal risk could chase people out of the industry, which can have implications, as Rachel has described. And on the other hand, maybe it creates a little bit of a set of, you know, the risk creates professionalism that may not exist in all aspects of the sector. What's your perspective on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Rachel's points are sound in that, you know, there will be no likely attrition where, you know, some organizations and people will walk away. I think to manage the risk, as we know, it's always going to then be a question of, you know, what is possible? What can somebody take on in terms of the size of the risk? Can they insure against it? Can they put contractual obligations in? What kind of mitigation measures can be put in place? And I suspect those are the kind of questions that will come to the fore. I mean, from a company perspective, probably having the potential of being able to hold an auditor liable or accountable will be better for them in many ways, because they will be able to rely 100% on the data, and they will be able to use what they see as a form of mitigation if there's litigation coming up against them. So, you know, I can also see that, you know, in a sense there might be some conflict there, you know, where the companies can see perhaps benefits in this, and perhaps some of the auditing firms and the personal auditors will find this quite tricky. So I don't have a 100%, you know, clear answer. I just think that, I guess, as with most emerging legislation, emerging standards, there has to be conversations. There has to be, as Rachel said, you know, the legislation that's drafted that people can interpret fairly, that is good legislation. And then always it will come down to how is it implemented. And that's what we see when, you know, the law is drafted and assented to. How is it then transposed? How is it implemented? And what falls out from that? And, you know, and practices develop, don't they? When you see the likes of bribery legislation, you know, the practices that have developed have been, you know, particular stances taken in contracts, in training by businesses. So there's an approach that's adopted, and I guess this is going to be the same with auditor liability.
So Matthias, what's your perspective? How's the IOE seeing this in terms of the increased legal risks and challenges to social auditor firms? Positive, negative, in between, little of both?
No, first of all, I think there is an impact for the companies, of course, when they are becoming liable for supply chains. And what we will see, and I'm pretty sure about that, is a de-investment and de-risking. You know, companies going out of certain regions because it's just too risky. They can't control what is going on in the supply chain, so they rather move on, right? They move to other regions and to source from. And I think the impact for the auditor will be that much more costly for them, right? I'm pretty sure they want to insure themselves against the risks, you know, that they miss something. I'm sure they will have a much more focus on getting the right people, and good thing, because at the end of the day, it will push forward the further professionalism of the sector, right? I don't think that in future freelancers have any chance. No company will use a freelancer for the audits because they will never be sure, you know, they can't hold this guy accountable properly when, you know, findings are not proper. They cannot really trust this person properly to do a comprehensive job. They cannot, you know, go back to this person if they have further findings. So I really think it will drive the professionalism of the sector, which is good. And lastly, what I said in my first statement, there is a real communication problem for social auditor in this international debate. It is seen as an industry which only wants to make money but doesn't care about the workers. So these can go hand in hand in order to not only show that, you know, this sector is extremely professional, but also communicate that in a much better way in order to also allow them companies who use social auditors that they don't need to be always defensive why they use social auditors, but be more proactive and say, actually, this is our ear and eye on the ground to better understand what is going on there.
It's terrific. So let me, I think we have probably time for one more question. So let me combine two questions that have come in that are getting a little bit more technical about conducting social audits. And one of them, and these, you know, go to a little bit of the points that were being made before. And point one is, should there be a minimum, a position on minimum duration? Should APSCA have a position on minimum duration for a social audit, which is a critical aspect in determining effectiveness and also connected to potential liability, duration? And then the second is, as we talk about the potential for chasing folks out of the sector, can the flexibility of virtual assessments and other technology tools help alleviate that, or does that create its own type of liability concern? So minimum duration and virtual assessments. So what do you think about that? Why don't we start with you, Matthias, and then work our way back across?
Thank you. So the minimum duration, I really would find it difficult. I'm not an expert in social audits, but I would guess a social audit really depends about how complex the company is, how complex the task is, right? What you are tasked to find. So I would find it very difficult to say you have to stay these or that long. For me, it is more about what are the key elements of an audit. And key elements for me include, for instance, anonymous interview with workers to really verify what you see from the management in the books reflect the reality on the ground. So I would rather, instead of focusing on timing, I would focus what are the key elements who needs to be ticked off. That's number one. And number two, with regards to the liability questions these new technology raises, I think there are a lot of questions about that, right? If you just think about workers' voice, if something goes wrong there, and the management of a supplier gets to know who answered how and started to retaliate, right, against these workers, you have it. That's the number one, and you have a classical storm in the box coming up to you because of that. So, and because these are new technologies where we all try to get more and more experience, the risks are higher, right? Because making sure that in the second tier and the third tier, these mobile phones and the technology really works, that no one has insight to understand who answered one, it's a challenge where I think a lot of questions coming up with regards to what is happening when it goes wrong. Thank you.
Good. So Colleen, minimum standards, virtual assessments, are those potential standards and tools that ultimately can be helpful from a liability standpoint, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Matthias. I'm not an expert on social audit, and I certainly take the points that he's made as well, is that actually the critical element is, that somebody is equipped in such a way that, when they're asking questions, that they are also intuitive as to what else it might be that they need to be looking for. I mean, what I have seen in some training that we've done previously with auditors is that, sometimes the time element is important to be able to perhaps take things off-site, work accommodation, or looking at things beyond what you might just be seeing in that particular place. So, I think as long as we move away from what is a tick box, then, the timing and the intuition needs to be built into this in accordance to the scope. And I'm sure actually Rachel has probably got a much more sensible answer to this, being the expert. Just on the virtual data, I think that there's a place for it all. I think, from what I said in the beginning, what I'm also seeing with businesses is that using worker voice technology, using data platforms to gather self-assessments and use that data is seen as part of a broader due diligence framework. And certainly, there are going to be elements of, what are the confidentiality issues, what are potential safeguarding issues that you need to put in place. All those things are having to, I think that the data providers are having to grapple with this anyway, and as they learn and do things more, and as people make mistakes, as is always the case, things will get improved. So, I personally don't see any of that going away. I think it's a question of how all of it is used interactively in a really substantial due diligence framework.
Good. So Rochelle, I'm going to give you the last word, and I think we're pretty close to our time. So what do you think? Duration, virtual assessments, are these effective standards, tools that we can use? What do you think?
So I think duration is too prescriptive of a way to look at it. I think most of the time, for example, if we're looking at auditing through a multi-stakeholder initiative, it's based on scope. So you're looking at the worker site population, you're looking at what's effective sample. Those are usually defined in those initiatives. I think APSCA itself even has a minimum standard around scope. But it's not particularly duration because, there are all kinds of organizations that become part of social auditing, including small family farms or non-family farms that are small, just small operations, even home worker type production. So it requires a level of flexibility when you think of global supply chains. They're not all large factories in China. So there needs to be some level of adaptability. So I hesitate to anything that seems too prescriptive. But I think the way that we're set up, and I don't know how this would be altered with legislation, but audit firms tend to have requirements for quality. And we had a panel last night with Laura Rubo from Disney, and she made the point that Disney does its own quality assessment of their audit firms. They will audit us to make sure we're doing a good job in the way that we're fulfilling our requirements and what we say that we're delivering to them. So I think that there are expectations around how that's done, and certainly every brand, every client that we work with as an audit firm, we have specific protocols that we agree to adhere to as far as our sampling goes. And a lot of times it's the brand themselves that makes determinations around whether or not they're doing multiple day events. So I think that there's a lot to take into account there. Certainly having minimums around sampling is important. I think that you do need some minimums around the number of people that you're talking to, the number of documents you're looking at. But if you're at a farm that has 5 workers, it only takes a certain amount of time to speak to all of them and proceed from there. As far as virtual, we're talking about, Colleen was mentioning some like survey data and things like that. I think, again, whatever you have that can be used to advance knowledge and understanding of supplier practices is good. I think it's best to combine all of these things together and not over rely on one resource. Certainly there are, what's the word I want, just limitations to any kind of resource. So the more that you combine, I think the better quality data and picture you're going to have. and over-reliance on one maybe can skew you. Certainly things that are virtual, in essence, can maybe be subject to misuse. You don't necessarily know who's providing the data on the other end of things. So, everything should be addressed or used within the limitations and constraints that exist on it. So I think it's just important to just be aware of the limitations of any kind of data that you want to use, recognize them, use it accordingly.
So I want to thank our panel. Terrific comments, terrific observations, really insightful stuff this morning. So thank you guys very, very much. And certainly I'm sure all of our panelists would be very happy to answer further questions offline if folks do want to get in touch with them bilaterally. But with that, thank you everybody for joining this morning. Greatly appreciate the attendance, and gonna hand it back over, Rana.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, John, for another wonderful panel. You set a very high bar with the session yesterday, and it was great to see that matched with another really invigorating and educational conversation. So thank you to John, Colleen, Matthias, and Rochelle. Really appreciate your time and insights, and it was absolutely worth every penny of the 1 hour CPD that is going to be made available to folks who were in attendance.